Hi, my name's Chris Sanders and I work for PGG Rights and Seeds at the top of the South Island. Joining me today, I have Matt Strahan. Now, Matt works for Nufarm based in the North Island. How are you today, Matt?
Good, thanks, Chris.
That's the story. So what the plan for today is just to have a bit of an overview of herbicide options available for spraying new pastures, and also just a bit of a discussion around why you would want to be spraying these new pastures. So just at this time of year, there's a lot of pastures that have just been sown, probably coming up, starting to get a bit of growth on them. And so there's probably timely just to talk about keeping those pastures clean from weeds. So unfortunately, when you plant your new grass and clovers, not only that is going to be establishing, but also a lot of weed species are also going to be trying to establish at the same time. Now, this is going to lower the utilisation of your pasture, but also mainly be competition from this new seed. So it's going to be competing for nutrients, it's going to be competing for moisture, and so that's something that we want to avoid. So Matt, just in your experience and when you're talking to farmers, what are the factors that they should be looking at to determine whether a pasture is ready to be sprayed or not?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on today. And I guess at the end of the day, most farmers, when they're putting a new pasture in, are all after a nice, dense, productive, persistent pasture. And as far as weeds go, they can have an impact on those sorts of things. There's a couple of rules of thumb before we start spraying and deciding what we're going to spray with that's required. And they are things like the first one, having at least 70 to 80% ground cover, because what we're applying, the herbicides, depending on the situation, can have an impact on the pasture varieties, the ryegrass, clovers and other things that are gone in the ground from germinating. So we've got to have 90 to 95% of that germinated and some plant material to spray. And the other rule of thumb is clovers need to have at least 1 to 2 trifoliate leaves up. So when we say trifoliate leaves, they're true leaves. And if you think of a clover leaf, they've generally got 3 leaves on it, but that's 1 trifoliate or 1 true leaf.
Yeah, okay. Good point to know. Is that just to give the clover enough maturity to handle that herbicide being applied to it?
Exactly, yeah. There's lots of different herbicide options. Things like your MCPB, MCPA brews like Thistrol, or you might be tank mixing that with Valdo that's got flumetchulam in it, or a pre-mix of the two together, like Thistrol Tribal Gold, and that's important that the clovers are big enough to handle the chemical, yeah.
So the clover's more susceptible to the ryegrass being damaged, obviously?
Yeah, as long as the ryegrass is germinated and got a couple of leaves, then those products are all pretty safe. So it's the clovers that are important as far as the timing goes, making sure they're big enough. And then after that, the weeds, as far as size is everything, not only for the pasture species, but for the weeds as well, because we're using those types of herbicides, which are quite soft, not only on the clover, but also the weeds. The weeds ideally want to be about the size of a 50 cent piece, so that we're getting good control of those. As they get bigger, they get harder to control, and you don't get as good a result.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned the ground cover. So is that to avoid having bare dirt? Does that absorb the herbicide, or what's the reason for the ground cover?
Yeah, so that's right. In that situation, the plants that are there will absorb the herbicides. And if you don't have enough plant material to absorb the herbicides, those herbicides sit on the soil and stop the pasture species from germinating and coming through. Okay. Generally, it's not too much of a problem, because in most practical situations, you've got farmers probably waiting till they've got a full germination, not only of your pasture species, but weeds. And timing as far as early goes is not too common for that to be a problem. It's more common that they're leaving a little bit too long and the weeds are getting a little bit too big.
Yeah, how you said there, 50 cent piece, that's quite a small weed, isn't it? Because like in most cases when farmers are contacting me, their definition of a small weed and my definition of a small weed would be a lot bigger than a 50 cent piece. So you're talking really small.
Ideally sort of 4 to 6 leaves depending on the plant. Rather than I guess some people think of a toast plate or something that might be up to your ankle in height, or yet alone the top of your red bean gumboot for those dairy farmers. It's well before that to get a good result.
Yeah, okay, so it's quite a balancing act that you're talking about, really, aren't you? Because you're wanting to make sure that those clovers are big enough to handle the herbicide, and yet your weeds are wanting to be very small to get control of them properly. Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. Sometimes farmers are lucky and everything sort of lines up for the timing perfect, but that's not always the case. And typically when I'm having conversations with either farmers or retail field reps, it's a bit of a balancing act between, weed control and a bit of, clover or other species sort of damage, and just getting the right fit.
Okay. So it probably, goes into my next question, in that probably up in the North Island at the moment, you've had a lot of pastures that have only just been sown, or they're still quite small. Some of the pastures down here in the South Island, we're starting to get a wee bit of growth on them where they got them in earlier. Now, a question I get asked is, should they be spraying before grazing, or are they better to leave it till after a grazing for spraying? What's your opinion on that, Matt?
Yeah, good question. Ideally, a spray before grazing gives the best results, but every farm and situation is a little different. So that as far as spraying goes, they generally fit into one of two camps, either a pre-graze spray with something that's sort of quite soft where the weeds do have to be quite small, or a post-grazing situation where you're spraying after a full graze. And that first graze onwards, you can use products like sort of Batten and Valdo together to help broaden the weed spectrum. But it's really important that it is after a full graze. Some people think, when you've got your pasture species ready for a light nip in the old pluck test, and you might run some light stock over them to do that. That's not the first full graze. It's after the next one where you're actually got the stock removing some of the clover leaves.
Okay.
And then it's safe for something like Batten and or Valdo to go together over the top.
Because that would be partly, you would have removed some of that clover so it wouldn't be there to absorb the chemical. Would that be right?
Yeah, I've had sort of conversations or comments over the years where people have made the point where they think Batten can be a bit harsh, but as long as it's had a graze, the clover, and you're spraying the weeds maybe 3 to 5 days after a grazing, you've allowed them to freshen, then you get pretty good weed efficacy at around a kilo to 1.5 kilos per hectare of Batten with your Valdo. And in my experience, I've had some very good looking new pastures respond after that, where you've controlled the weeds and got a lot of clover coming out of the winter and that early spring period.
Okay, because like that grazing, you'd have to consider some of these herbicides would have a withholding after you've sprayed them before you can graze them. Would that
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, all the phenoxy ones, so the likes of your 2,4-D amines like Batten or your Thistrol, MCPB, MCPA type Bruce don't have a grazing withholding. It is important that we try to leave them for a good sort of 3 to 5 days as a minimum after spraying, just to allow the chemical time to get around the plant, the weeds, to kill them. And then if you're using a flumetylene product like Valdo or what's in also Tribal Gold, that does have a 14-day grazing withholding period. So you're right, you've got to make sure that that's part of the thinking process and when you're spraying your new pastures, so that if you're using a flumetylene product, that you're not grazing them within 14 days.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
Just to add to, the Valdo and flumetylene products, why you might be throwing one of those across the paddock if you've got problem weeds like chickweed can be really invasive and choke out new pastures, as can sparry, or for those southerners, yar, and buttercups. It depends on the situation, what sort of herbicides you're throwing over the top of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think that covers off the new pastures quite well, but I know, talking to my colleagues recently, there's been a lot of undersowing of pastures that have been damaged by the dry, but excuse me, particularly up your part of the country. So in this sort of scenario, is it still worth putting a herbicide over those pastures in your recommendation, Matt?
Yeah, Chris, this year we've had a lot of autumn undersowing going on thanks to the dry or drought in some regions. And it's not a new process. There's a lot of it that goes on every year. But thanks to the conditions most farmers have faced over the last 6 months, they've got quite a lot of open pastures, and the pasture density is not there, and they're not going to get the the pasture cover levels, your average pasture cover up to the level they'd like to going into the winter. So there's been a lot of autumn undersowing going on. This year, because things are so open, once we get some significant rains, not only will those grasses that farmers are drilling in at the moment or have been germinate, so will weeds, and there won't be a lot of competition from existing pasture there. So we're expecting, in more situations than usual, the need for an autumn application of a herbicide in these situations.
Yeah, okay. So you're just talking there about pasture covers being back, and that's pretty much the case around the whole of the country. Now, I know Nufarm, they market ProGibb, do they? So, Matt, just on that side of things with trying to boost up feed supplies coming into winter, like, should people be using ProGibb yet, or is it a wee bit early?
It'll depend on sort of where in the country you are and your situation. I know down south they're starting to get a bit of ProGibb going out at the moment. Up here in the north, we're not too far away from that happening. And typically ProGibb sort of used going into the winter, probably sort of more May, June, to try and push pasture cover going into that cold period. Rather than leaving it too late, if you apply it sooner, that 30 to 60% increase in pasture response over a 3-week period. If your pastures are only growing 10 or 15 kgs of dry matter, the response from your ProGibb application in total dry matter becomes less and less as you get into that colder winter period. Okay. So trying to have a good feel as far as a feed wedge goes, and applying it a little bit sooner rather than later will yield them a heck of a lot more dry matter in the areas it's applied to.
And you recommend using that in conjunction with urea use?
Yeah, one of the good things about ProGibb is its pasture response, that 30 to 60% increase, will be in addition to a nitrogen application, whatever that nitrogen form may be. So, if you're expecting a 10-to-1 typical sort of rule of thumb response out of a nitrogen application, a ProGibb application at the same time will boost that even further. So a lot of people do use liquid nitrogen products when they're spraying their ProGibb and contact on. Okay.
Now, Matt, can you use ProGibb on your new pastures? Because I know that's always been something that's talked about.
Yeah, we don't recommend that. We want to make sure that our new pastures get a chance to get up and growing and get a chance to sort of create a few reserves and try and tiller out and grow some roots. So we don't encourage that for the first 6 months. Okay. But just coming back to ProGibb as far as when to put it on in established pastures, it's really important that it's used as part of a rotational grazing situation. So in a dairy perspective, ideally it's within the first 3 days of grazing. So you're applying it within 3 days of grazing, and then you're coming back in to graze that area within, or at 3 weeks basically after your ProGibb application. And in some ag research trials, that's shown somewhere in the vicinity across a few trials of around sort of 240, 250 kgs of dry matter extra above untreated.
Okay, feed like that could be very valuable in a season like the one we've had. Yeah. Oh no, that's great, Matt. Thanks for your knowledge there and sharing with us here today. So, like some of this information that you've got, does Nufarm have a website, or are you able to be contacted?
If it's not your local rural retailer, they've got a lot of our information in stores, or your local spray contractor. Our Nufarm territory managers are all scattered around the countryside. Those contacts are on our website. You can call any of the Nufarm territory manager team. And talking about our website, we've got some handy sort of resources there, whether it's new pasture herbicide options booklet, things supporting ProGibb like we've just talked about. So if you check that out, you'll find some additional resources that go into a little bit more detail than we have today.
Oh no, that's great. Appreciate that. So thanks everybody for coming along and joining us today. If you've got any questions about what we've talked about today, or if you've got any other subjects that you'd like us to touch on in these type of meetings, well, please contact your local PGG Wrightson and Seeds agronomist. We've got an 0800 number, 0800 805 505, and we're more than happy to help if we can. So thanks very much, and thanks you, Matt, for joining us and helping us here today.
No worries. All the best for the autumn and winter ahead.
Excellent.